Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this public session of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. Our intention today is to explore potential changes to the governance of FBS football and the impact of the sport on the NCAA and all of college sports. And I'm a poor substitute for Nancy Zimpher, who is going to lead this discussion this morning. First, I want to thank the Knight Foundation on behalf of the entire commission for their support of this meeting and our efforts to advance college athletic education, health, safety, and success. A few quick points before we begin the session. As everyone knows, this will be both in person and on Zoom, and the recorded video and other meeting materials will be available on knightcommission.org. Commission members and panelists participating in person should use their microphones when speaking, please. And Knight Commission members participating via Zoom should use the raise hand feature during the Q&A. We'll also welcome the media and others participating via Zoom to this discussion. And with the media, we'll hold a press conference at 12 o'clock. During this session, representatives from LEAD1 will share details about its proposed governance model for FBS football and the research that informed its proposal. Following LEAD1's overview of their proposal, Knight Commission members will ask questions and engage in a discussion with the panelists about areas of common interest, where more specificity may be needed or where more work may still be needed. It's important to note from the outset that LEAD1 is the Association of FBS Athletic Directors. There are 131 universities that are classified in the Football Bowl subdivision, or FBS. FBS institutions are the only institutions that receive money from the College Football Playoff, which is the FBS Football National Championship. As background for this discussion and to be transparent about the Commission's prior work and public viewpoints, in February of 2020, the Knight Commission first proposed a new governance structure for FBS football, separate from the NCAA and funded by the College Football Playoff revenues. The Commission's proposal requires that the FBS Football Governing Board be led by independent directors, including at least one health and safety expert, as well as representation from football players. The Commission believes the reform of FBS governance is especially urgent with the impending expansion of the CFP, which is managed by a corporation that operates separately from the NCAA, with revenues from media rights that will approach $2 billion, an amount that will soon dwarf NCAA revenues. The CFP revenue distribution is not managed by the NCAA, even though the NCAA has responsibility for overseeing FBS football. The CFP also does not contribute to funding the national costs of FBS football and does not fund the legal expenses or litigation settlements related to the sport. Those expenses are covered by NCAA March Madness basketball revenues. The CFP also does not require any of their funds to be designated for college football athletes' health and safety, education, or coaching diversity initiatives. We commend LEAD1 for their extensive study of these issues and look forward to the discussion. The three leading LEAD1 representatives you'll hear from today are Tom McMillan, who's their CEO. Eric, how do you say the name? Arian, I apologize, Arian Wright, Director of the Center for Research in Intercollegiate Athletics and Professor of Sports Administration at UNC Chapel Hill, who conducted the survey research that helped LEAD1 develop its proposal. And Jim Center, Vice President and Director of Athletics at UT El Paso, and a former football coach, will provide a practitioner's perspective. Thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over to Tom and your team. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Put your mic on.
It's actually confusing. It turns red when you push it, when you go. So.
You. There we go. So
problem solved. We won.
thank you. Mr. Chairman, thanks. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. And as I always say, when I come back to the Knight Commission, it feels like deja vu. 33 years ago, I was appointed to the commission. It was really been a highlight of my career to be involved. So very much appreciate the chance to be here today, and wish my former teammate was here. Oh, there he is. Lenny.
I'm here. I'm
I
here.
see you. Good. Well, it was an honor and privilege to play with Lenny at Maryland. So Lenny, thank you. And of course, I want to thank the Knight Commission for all your work that you did on this FBS governance issue. And it was very, very helpful to us. Amy, thank you for the work you did. And I want to thank Jim Center from coming up from El Paso and being part of this. He was very active in our deliberations. Arian Waite, Dr. Waite, who was introduced, very helpful with our surveying, our methodology, and she'll be going into this. And Bart Lambergen on my staff, who's our general counsel, really put enormous effort into this issue. Let me just kind of go through the chronology just for a second, how we got into this issue. Last May, as you recall, Gene Smith made a comment. He said, I think FBS governance needs to be moved out of the NCAA into the CFP. And that created quite a storm in the press. And then Gary Barta, the Iowa AD, came in right afterwards, and they both said this is something that should be considered. We asked Gene and Gary to talk to our board about this issue, and they went through their reasoning. And from that discussion, we said, look, our September meeting, which is our biggest meeting of the year, let's just focus on this issue. And so from May to September, we prepared for this discussion. In the interim, we created a work group of 40 ADs. And oftentimes what we do is LEAD1. We create work groups with our ADs and staff to work on issues, whether it's diversity or transfer portals or whatever. And on this one, we had 40 ADs. So there was very high interest in looking at this thing. And Ariane will talk about the survey and how it came together, but we ended up having 108 ADs fill out a survey. Many of the questions were helped along by the 40-member work group that we had. So their input was very valuable. And then we came into our annual meeting with the idea that we were going to try to educate our ADs. A lot of them really were not that familiar with FBS governance. So one of the folks that came in was Jen Frazier. Jen, I saw Jen, still see her. She gave a discussion of how the Football Oversight Committee works and how the system works within the NCAA. And then Ariane went through all of her survey data, which I'm going to turn over to her in a minute. Kathleen McNeely, who was the former CFO of the NCAA, had just recently left, gave us an inside look on, what does it cost to run FBS football? And finally, we had Oliver Luck, the former executive at the NCAA, who moderated this discussion for us. And so we had breakout groups. We had a very, very lengthy discussion, and Jim will go through all that. But when we went to Jen and her presentation, some of the issues that came up were about how folks are appointed on the Football Oversight Committee. And it came up that the Council Coordinating Committee, it's the 3 C's, if you will, or the triple C, appoints those folks, but only 2 of the 10 members are required to be FBS. So what you find happening on the Football Oversight Committee is sometimes a less representation from the FBS. 1/3 of that Football Oversight Committee is supposed to be from the FCS. So one of the things that we heard from commissioners and we heard from ADs was that, oftentimes we go to these meetings and we're talking about everything else but FBS football, and that FBS football is such a big part of college sports, representing 80% of the revenue. And there's a need to be a more focused approach on this issue. Look at just as an aside, look at the current NCAA search committee for a new president. Out of the 7 members, there are only 2 FBS representatives. And so oftentimes these issues, many feel, and Jim can elaborate on this, that FBS wasn't given the focus that is needed. So that was what, so Jen brought out how the system worked. She pointed out that within the Football Oversight Committee, only the FBS directors voted on those things, even though a lot of the discussion was around other issues beside FBS issues. Her input was very valuable. Then we heard from Kathleen McNeely, and she concluded that the cost to run FBS football would be about $65 million. Now, if you talk about real costs, and that means like direct costs, like enforcement and eligibility and all those things, it's probably $5 million. If you added litigation to that, it's probably another 10. Then you have insurance costs, primarily catastrophic, another 2. And you have miscellaneous costs, drug testing, administrative officiating, 6.5. So you end up with 23.5 million direct costs to run FBS football. But what also has to be taken into account is what happens to distributions, revenue distributions. And she pointed out that if the football factors were removed, FBS football factors removed, $42 million would be the net loss in revenue distribution. And here's how that works. $91 million goes to the FBS schools right now for distributions. But if you took out the football, and 49 million goes back to the FBS. If you took out FBS football, there would be a net $42 million loss. So in total, you've got about 24 million direct costs and 42 million that's related to distributions. And so that was brought out by the CFO. The most important thing she pointed out was the liability shield that the NCAA provides, that she would estimate that any new group would at least have to reserve $20 million a year just to deal with the liability, because they are on the front line of all the lawsuits, whether it's antitrust, concussions, or whatever. So that was the conclusion from the from her point of view. And then as we moved on this issue, we came to the conclusion at the end of the meeting that, and this was unanimous, that our ADs would rather see an effort to reform FBS football within the NCAA, and only failing that would they consider moving it to the outside. And so after we heard that, we convened another work group of 11 ADs. We again went on the listening tour, talking to commissioners, former commissioners, ADs, corporate governance experts, and the like, including as well as the CFP executive director. And in the spirit of not being overly prescriptive, not being overly detailed, but giving the broadest possible vision here, with the art of the possible, what is really possible, we came up with a conclusion that was really based upon 2 premises. One is that you create a parallel FBS football governance entity from the Division I Council. So you move a separate entity. In that entity, you're going to have 10 conference appointments of football knowledgeable folks. You're going to have 1 appointment from the the Coaches Association, and you're going to have 4 independents, 2 of which are student athletes or former student athletes, 2 of which are very knowledgeable and those could fit into different categories as well. The areas that we focused on was that board would have the authority on football matters within the FBS, but they would report to the board of the presidents, the board of directors, and that the delegation of authority would have to be sorted out. But certainly anything that would materially impact the NCAA financially, anything, that had material impact on health, safety, and those things. There are issues that obviously part of this higher ed structure that will have to go to the presidents, but a lot of the day-to-day football decision-making can be made by this board. The second recommendation was to create a strong chief operating officer within this organization, somewhat like what the role Dan Gavitt plays in basketball. If you look at the NCAA website and you look at the president's cabinet and the leadership, you will find no one there for football. Oliver Luck, in conversations with me, would say oftentimes at meetings, we were always asking, why was there not a football person here? So the idea here is to have someone strong in an operating role, the way that Dan Gavitt plays in the basketball world. If you think about basketball, Dan Gavitt is the sort of the chief operating officer. He takes care of a lot of the day-to-day issues. And then you have the basketball oversight committee. In football, all you have is a committee. They meet weekly. It's a big job, but you have football run by a committee with no strong operating officer. And so one of the simple recommendations is follow that what's worked with basketball. Put yourself a strong operating person with a very knowledgeable FBS focused board. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Ariane to give some of her methodology and her surveying, but in my conversations with the CFP executive director, it's clear to me that the CFP does not want to take on this liability, and that whoever moving this outside creates enormous liability magnet. And so right now the NCAA is absorbing that cost. They, it's very extensive. And for that reasons, we tabled the money issue. We say, look, let's make these modest improvements to governance and focus on the money issue down the road. Because there were calls for the NFL to put up money. There were calls for the CFP to put up money. There were calls for the conferences to put up money. But we felt that if we tried to solve that issue, we wouldn't be able to take this first step, which was to create a more streamlined, less bureaucratic governance structure. So that's a little bit of an overview of our process, how it worked. And I'll wait your questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Ariane to go through some of her results. Thank you. Here.
Thanks, Tom. This slide demonstrates a visual representation of the timeline and the process that LEAD1 took over the last several months. One thing I want to emphasize, building on what Tom mentioned, is really we started with the goal of building directly on the Knight Commission's recommendations. Jean and Gary, I believe, brought these issues forward because of their conversations with the Knight Commission and the Knight Commission research. And so really the process was building on the wonderful work that you have been doing. So Tom mentioned the survey, and here is our response. In all the surveys that I've done, I've never received an 82% response rate, particularly from ADs on a very quick time window. So I think this speaks to the urgency of the issue and also the power of LEAD1 in bringing together the athletic directors on very important issues. And as you'll see, as we go through the data, it's a very even split between Group of 5 and Power 5 institutions. All right, so why do we need to do this? Not only do we have a governance structure that isn't aligned in terms of revenue and authority, there's also a lot of other issues that were frustrating for the athletic directors. So what is here is what these frustrations are. There's frustration with the current model due to a lack of leadership broadly, with a lack of authority, accountability, and vision. Every stakeholder, including the NCAA leadership and staff, conference leaders, presidents, FARs, and ADs, point to each other as the sources of inaction or discontent, when the reality is, and it's an organizational structure issue and shared governance issue that is particularly problematic in football, because since 1984, the revenue hasn't followed the accountability. So lack of leadership is a big one. Organizational dysfunction, the bureaucracy, inability to get things done in a timely manner. And as Tom mentioned, the lack of football centricity in management, the lack of focus on this very important element of our college sport infrastructure. And the effects of all of these issues really are what we see written about in the media. Conference realignment. This is an effect of our current structure, greed and self-interest, individual conferences and institutions acting in the best for themselves. So building on those frustrations, we wanted to start with the areas of agreement. In the survey that we sent out, there were a lot of quantitative questions, a lot of qualitative questions, getting feedback from our ADs and summarizing all of this data. There were 6 areas that were broadly supported by all, meaning high relative agreement without large standard deviations, not only between Power 5 and Group of 5, but different groups of ADs themselves. So one thing to keep in mind is this vision. In order for us to accomplish a lot of these ideals, we need first an empowered decision-making structure to facilitate action. So hopefully many of these visions will be at the top of the list of priorities for our new governing structure as we move forward. So first, in terms of areas of agreement, the ADs expressed a desire to have a strong authoritative leader, either a commissioner, an authoritative board, whatever it looks like. They want power to act in a timely manner. What you see on the right of all of these slides are some direct quotes from the survey. Next, organizational alignment. ADs expressed a desire, really echoing Knight Commission recommendations, to have alignment between revenue, legal accountability, mission, and authority, with clear rules, a reduction of bureaucracy, and effective enforcement. And the ADs broadly, very strongly supported CFP and NFL financial and administrative support. So that is one of the very clear findings. Next, a revenue structure that maximizes school and FBS revenue generation. There's an asterisk by FBS because this was one of the issues that was significantly different between Power 5 and Group of 5 schools. But within this, athletic directors called for a collective media strategy, similar to the professional leagues. Geographic conference realignment for non-football sports, another thing that the Knight Commission has recommended in the past. Branding and licensing separate from the NCAA if we were to move to an outside structure. So again, not too surprising that it's important for the ADs to maximize revenue, but how we do that was interesting to see. Next, within the survey, it came forward that they do want a separate FBS structure with football-focused legislation, focus on football athletes, a football-specific year-round calendar, and standards for competitive equity for similarly situated FBS institutions. And there were many that said we need to get out of the NCAA. This was very split going into the decision-making at the meeting, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Another area of consensus, near consensus, was a desire for increased stakeholder inclusivity. ADs wanted a voice. It was really interesting for me to hear that because I feel like ADs have a voice, but they said their voice gets very muddled between the conference discussions and then straight to the NCAA. They wanted a clear process to provide real input. They also were very supportive of the idea of having independent experts serve because they've seen, as we all have, people voting with their own self-interest. And finally, a big segment wanted additional playoff inclusivity. So this was before the expanded playoff was released, but also another subset talked about having a separate group of 5 national championship or some degree of hope for a national championship for those in the FBS that wouldn't necessarily make it into the CFP. Then the final area of agreement didn't give its own slide, but a maintenance of NCAA voting power. So regardless of what happens, these ADs didn't want to lose their power within the NCAA. So as I mentioned, these were the areas of agreement going into our September meeting. Whoops. There we go. But there were a lot of areas that there was not conclusive data on. And this slide really demonstrates where we started our meeting in September. And we spent a lot of time that Jim's going to talk about, talking about what these areas of inclusivity, or I'm sorry, these areas of inconclusive data mean. What if we want independent oversight? Is it under the NCAA umbrella? Is it the recommendation of the Knight Commission, CFP? What does it look like? So these were what we spent hours and hours discussing with each of these areas of inconclusive data. And to give some insight into what these discussions look like and where we ended up, I'll turn the time over to our LEAD1 member, AD, Jim.
Let me just move this a little bit.
Well, good morning, everyone. In keeping with all things related to being an athletic director, nothing would be the same if you didn't have audio visual problems to start the meeting, right? So at the top of every athletic director's mindset is the scoreboard working? Is the PA system working, right? Something's down with the trailer or the truck or the broadcast. So I felt right at home as we started this session today. If you'll indulge me, I'll just tell you a quick little story. Here about 10 years ago, I went into my president's office at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I said, Dr. Peterson, I said, I want to be an AD. And what do you think? Should I work on my doctorate or should I work on a master's degree? And Bud told me, he said, Jim, he said, it's really a business. I'd encourage you. I don't know if you remember this conversation. I'd encourage you. It was we both slept since then, but he said, I think it'd be really good. Go get your MBA. He said, I mean, you're running a big business. And I thought that was great advice. And at the same time, here I am, 10 years into being a Division I athletic director. And to be honest with you, I wish I had a law degree, because the things that we talk about almost always keep coming back to things related to the law or someone's interpretation of the law, right? Antitrust issues, collusion, First Amendment rights. Just recently this week, there's an article we all read about what constitutes someone's First Amendment rights, and or is it Title IX? In terms of discrimination, whether a student athlete can do something that we would mostly think is inappropriate and shouldn't represent someone's team. It's very, 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 very challenging to know what the right thing to do is all the time, and to not step on a landmine, frankly. But let me just say thank you to this group for your hard work. The brain power that's in this room is astonishing, and I'm honored to be able to share on behalf of our colleagues with the LEAD1 athletic directors. I'm just one voice, but I think I can share some of the concerns, some of the frustrations that we have collectively in how we approach our daily work as practitioners and trying to serve our student athletes, trying to serve our universities and the administration, the alumni, and the different stakeholders. So there's a lot to it. As Ariane had shared, it's easy. As you all know, it's easy to get a bunch of people in a room and all talk and complain about the challenges of the business. And we're really good at it, right? And you'll get the same thing if you put coaches in a room and whatnot. But at the end of the day, trying to come up with solutions to the challenges is really, really cumbersome process and takes a lot of effort. I like Greg Sankey's comment about, challenges or problems yield to effort. When you put focus, you guys have been working at this for a long time. The Knight Commission has on trying to address the issues of intercollegiate athletics. They're complex. It's like a spider web. When it gets stuck to you, it's hard to get it off because it's just everywhere. And it is one of the challenges of our day. And frankly, it's one of the most highly visible things that's out there, because somebody in America, no matter if you like sports or you don't, you have an opinion about what you see and read and how you think things are going. It's impossible to escape it. And so the decisions that are made do have an impact, and everybody is looking, everyone's watching. So as we think about, governance oversight, I can tell you the last meeting that we had here in DC was, I think, one of the best ones that we've had, because you had all of us in the room, but the majority, how many were there? 108? All together, 100 plus. And one of the things that I found was really, really meaningful is based on where we're setting. If we were to just count off, okay, the four of us are gonna collaborate, the next four, the next four, the next four. And we were actually able, you could be setting with a Power 5 AD, right? And you're talking about the same issues, which typically we don't do. We tend to be very, very compartmentalized by conferences, but as the survey questions came up, we had a discussion about each of those. Then we're able to put in what our answer was in format, some concept to support a particular question or recommendation or amend it. That was one of the most productive meetings I think that we've had, because it forced us to break down into much smaller subsets. And it wasn't, me talking as a group of five with somebody else with a Power 5. It was us talking more about the issue per se. It was very, very helpful in a lot of the information that Ariane has put together in a slide deck in PowerPoint has led us to the realization that while we all struggle with the NCAA, we have sometimes forgotten that we are the NCAA, right? If we're mad at the NCAA, point the finger, look in the mirror and point the finger at yourself. Right. And I'm not just talking about ADs, I'm talking about coaches, and I'm talking about presidents, right? We all have got to own where we're at today, right? The second thing is, it's easy to talk about leadership and what you don't feel like you're getting out of leadership, then come forward with something that looks different, feels different, is going to address your leadership needs. And my sense is we came from that collectively as a group feeling like, now that we get to thinking about it, the NCAA really isn't the bad boy here. They actually provide a ton of services. They do the best that they can, given the membership and what the membership tells them to do, right? And we've got to get on board with how do we address the issues maybe within our own structure and clean it up. And I think that's where we got to collectively as a group. Why don't we just keep this in house, but just try to make it better? So, Ariane, can you go to the next slide if you don't mind? So this is the current structure, right? Everybody's, I think, very, very familiar with this, and they know how this works, and they can see it. And what kept coming up from those survey questions was, how do we make this easier? How do we make it better? How do we spend time addressing FBS issues and not everybody else's issues, right? Whether it's FCS or non-football related issues. So this is the current structure that we work within. I would say the Football Oversight Committee, there's a lot of great people on there. They do a lot of really good work, and they have been pretty doggone responsive. I think particularly as of late, the last couple of years, I think have done a yeoman's job. But even when it goes from there up to the next level, it tends to get bogged down. The FCS the Oversight Committee tends to act decisively with a lot of good work, with a lot of really good people, but it gets encumbered in the red tape and the bureaucracy of governance. So next slide, please. So this was talked about a little bit earlier, from Tom, and there's a lot of people that weigh in on FBS without having FBS experience. And so we recognize it doesn't mean that someone's opinion or their thought process isn't valuable. It's just that when you're having to live and make the decisions at the athletic director level. And there's lots of people weighing in on what you should and shouldn't do. And you don't have to live with the consequences of decision-making. It can be a real challenge trying to navigate that space. Next slide here. So we came up with this idea that we want to bring forward, and that's to create a more streamlined decision-making process for FBS football that remains within the NCAA. If the NCAA cannot facilitate this change, we're in favor of examining options for such decision-making outside of the NCAA. And that wasn't meant to be a threat in any way, shape, or form. We were just trying to say, we got to figure this out, gang. What does it look like? So help us with that. And we wanted to go to the mothership, if you will, the NCAA, and say, this is what we're looking for. So can you go to the next slide, Marianne? So what we were proposing is let's try to streamline this and get rid of the way the process has been working in favor of something that we believe would meet the needs of FBS members, the athletic directors and the coaches and the presidents, if it was at all possible. So next slide. So then you can see the contrast here. We were proposing that we have a football governing board, a very, very strong football governing board with expertise in FBS football, right? And that person or that board would be supported by a COO, if you will, if you give it any title you want, but we kept using the word czar, which I don't think, as we all thought about that and what happened to the czars, that was really not a very good thing to do. So, but really what you can see is we're saying we need strong leadership with that board and the decision-making body that allows things to move a lot quicker with a lot less encumbrance than we currently operate in terms of the structure. And we feel like that person obviously would need a team of people. If we're staying within the NCAA, let me back up just a second. Whether it's in the NCAA or outside the NCAA, it would take a team of people to manage an entity that's as big as FBS football, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar organization. Now it's split up into many parts, 10 conferences, lots of moving things and lots of issues, but it would take a full staff dedicated to the issues of FBS football. And so our thought, and I know many people, everybody in there knows Dan Gavitt and what he does with NCAA and the basketball part of our business. Does a great job, but we kind of look at NCAA basketball at talk to Dan. You got a question, talk to Dan. You want to change something, talk to Dan, because he's kind of like the main guy. And we feel like we don't have that in FBS football. If anything, it's diluted down to a committee, and a great majority of those folks do not have FBS on the top of their mind or in their background and DNA. That's why we think that's really important. Next slide. Is that the last one? Go, here we go. So I can tell you there's a lot of moving parts to this. Every single day, I can tell you as an athletic director, I get up and I think about the divergent stakeholders that I'm trying to please and who's trying to get a piece of our business or who we're trying to address. I'm not sitting here saying I think this is going to be the end of what we could make a decision. If this body right here could make a decision, we put it in play today, I feel very, very certain in 2, 3, or 4 years, we could be looking at something that may be totally different because the world that we're living in is changing so quickly. And I personally, I'm not saying it's always for the best. I can't tell you an AD that I talk to that doesn't think that name, image, and likeness is not a good thing for student athletes. They think it is. But the overwhelming majority are not for pay for play, right? They're not for basically finding a way to funnel money to student athletes. We worked for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years trying to keep boosters, right, from running the enterprise, right? Overzealous boosters, people who are not committed to the academic integrity of institutions. And yet in 12 to 18 months, it's kind of like the inmates are running the prison. I don't know any ADs that are fired up about that. It is a real challenge, right? So we've got to figure out how do we do that. The flip side of that is how do we do a better job of supporting student athletes and student athlete welfare at a level that makes sense? I ask my colleagues all the time, how much is enough? How much more do we need to do for student athletes that go to our institutions? I think there's some things that I scratch my head. Ariane and I were talking earlier about the difference between head count in equivalency sports. That makes no sense to me. How I look at my two daughters and say, you're a softball player, you get 0.5, and you're a tennis player and you get a full scholarship. I don't get it, right? There's some things like that that are real head scratchers for me. The flip side of that is, how do you fund those kinds of initiatives? When it comes right down to it, every single person in this room has an income and you have a budget to maintain your household. And there's tough decisions you have to make. Well, we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that. I have to do that same thing on behalf of my institution. Right. And we've got to, we can't forget who we are, where we're at. Every institution is different and has a different complexity and different wherewithal. And so I think one of our biggest challenges is when you think about even within FBS, I made a note here to myself. I think the lowest FBS, well, excuse me, let me just back up. The lowest Division I athletic budget is $3 to $4 million, Division I, and they have FCS football. And then we have some at the other end, right? Division I that have FBS football that are north of 250 million. And there are times when the vote's all the same. It's kind of hard to believe. It really is. And then you have schools that are all the way along the pendulum. So we're probably not going to come up with one thing that's going to satisfy everybody. I don't see how that can be. And that's why some of the stratification is there with FCS. And I spent as many years being an FCS AD as I have being an FBS AD. So I understand the issues there. But there's stratification in the group of five. There's stratification in the autonomous conferences, right? And so we're not really homogenous. And I'll just offer this one little thing too. As much as we talk about intercollegiate athletics, we're really a microcosm of what's happening across America. As support for higher education continues to drop, I'm talking about public funding, right, from each state or the feds continue to drop, then it's incumbent upon every single institution, if you're going to remain viable, to recruit more students, right? And recruit the finest faculty that you can recruit in research and build buildings and academic programs. And that's why everybody continues to chase the US News and World Rankings, right? And I know that even some of that's changing, right? It was a very dynamic thing last couple of weeks. But my point is, athletics is not more important than anything else going on campus, but it's not less important either, which is why this group is trying to address the things that are going on. But campuses are involved in this arms race, just like athletics is. I see it on my own campus. And I see it all around, all across the country as everybody is fighting for a declining student population to fund their enterprise on campus. So with that being said, I've spoken way too long. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your presentation and all the hard work that you've undertaken to address these issues. Ariane, I'll start with just a question for you, and that is that it appears that the data that you collected initially and then the decisions that were made after the meetings in September seem to be different. The sentiments seem to be different in that there was strong desire for a separation of FBS football, that the ADs didn't see the NCAA playing a very necessary role, except in areas like initial eligibility or those kinds of things. And so was it just the opportunity that Jim talked about, where everybody finally got in a room and they could talk to each other in a more constructive manner, that changed the sentiment? Because the letters that you sent to President Moorhead seemed to be somewhat incongruous with what the data had suggested when it was collected. So I'm just curious as to, you know, how you feel about the difference there.
All right, Kane. Well, I'm glad that we have the slide up there that you're referring to. What this was a question relative to different facets that the NCAA currently oversees and whether the ADs had a preference for them to remain within the NCAA or outside of the NCAA. And the question was asked with the current structure of the NCAA in mind. So as you'll see, a couple of things. One, most of the means are towards the middle. And so it's a 5-point scale with those towards 5 lending toward oversight. Let's see. 1 was independent oversight, so outside of the NCAA. 5 was oversight of current NCAA structures. So having it be within, which seems backwards to me. But one thing to point out is the standard deviations are all over 1.0 or just about, which seems to demonstrate, which does demonstrate that there's significant variance within the ADs. There were a lot of people that said we want it outside of the NCAA, and there were a lot of people that said we want it inside the NCAA, which pushed all the means towards the middle. So while it looks like it's a little bit different, part of it is that's assuming the current NCAA structure, and there very conclusively isn't confidence in the current NCAA structure. Going into the meeting, the standard, what we've said a couple times to the meeting is the status quo is no longer acceptable. And so having these elements done in the current system, nobody wants that. It's not working. But if we're able to have an independent structure under the NCAA umbrella, that is what the ADs got toward. And part of that recommendation is if we can't do this, then let's go outside. So there is a little bit of difference.
May I just add to that real quickly? Part of the meeting was to educate. And in that education process involving money and how the current system works, that's certainly informed the final decision. But I would agree with you, there was a lot of ambivalence going into it. And so I think it was clear coming out of the meeting that there was a unanimous feeling that give it a shot within the NCAA. They want to see something done now, and complicating it with the money issues would probably protract that for quite a while. So that's how it works.
Well, thank you for that. And you know, Jim, to some of your comments about the data and the lack of feeling like there's representation. You know, the irony of that is that of the members on the board of directors, 10 of them are permanent members of FBS. And yet there are 32 conferences, and so 22 conferences don't have that same privilege. And yet all of the decisions that are made at the board level are much broader than FBS football. So the frustration that your members are feeling is a frustration that many members across the association have felt for a long time with respect to things like that. And I don't mean to be disrespectful. I just thought it was kind of interesting that the last 2 major reform requests that were put through, federated setup and autonomy, were the recommendations and the requests of FBS membership. And so they wanted that autonomy to be able to better structure the decision-making process, the council legislation, that sort of thing. So it's just an interesting perspective from someone that's not been in the Power 5 or FBS football. But to your point, Jim and Tom, with respect to the revenue, it does feel as though the conversations around revenue distribution are being sort of deferred. And I understand some of the rationale for that. But with the pending expansion of the CFP, the likelihood is that you're now talking about billions of dollars being generated in a particular year. And unlike the basketball revenues that fund the entire enterprise, the football monies do not do that. And they're going to become much greater than any of the monies that is generated from basketball. And so the idea that you could have governance without the control of the finances, the revenues, is something that seems inconsistent as well. So can you just speak to are you of the mind that folks are still going to suggest that the money shouldn't be distributed across the entire enterprise? And yet they may still find a way to fund some of the function of the NCAA staff and the work that they do from some of those monies, because athlete health and safety, diversity and inclusion efforts and things like that, that the Knight Commission has asked the CFP to think about with the revenues that they've generated. As of yet, they haven't done that. And I'm wondering if you feel as though that revenue distribution will start to address these really important issues around student athlete health and safety, education, and diversity and inclusion efforts.
You know, in my conversations with Bill Hancock, you know, it was clear that the CFP would love to stay far away from these governance issues as possible, even though, you know, when you expand the playoff and so forth, it does impinge on governance and how much time kids are going to be out of school and so forth. We just, in looking through all that, even though that misalignment still or non-alignment still is occurring, we felt that this was a doable step that could be done now. And those money issues need to be addressed. I mean, clearly they need to be addressed, and they're going to have to be addressed. You know, there's another real politic concern here, and that is, you know, you ask yourself, why is the NCAA even in this business of FBS governance? That would be a natural question. Why are they even fooling with us? I mean, there's no money. They're getting hit on the head with litigation. And we've asked that question. I think the answer to it from two different perspectives. One is that's what the members want. They want this kind of distribution. And the second thing is, in my view, and from others, that when the TBS-CBS contract was renewed, there should have been a grant of rights from every school that's in that basketball tournament. I think that that would have given the NCAA a lot more leverage on these issues. I think there's a real underlying fear that, you know, the basketball tournament is a valuable asset, but not very well protected from the standpoint of the schools. I raise that because you have to wonder why, you know, why this wasn't locked down. I'm sure CBS and NBC protected themselves in their contract, but conversely, there's nothing really holding the schools. And so this is a balancing act. But I do, from a lot of our schools, they mention the whole NFL issue, the fact that the NFL should be stepping up here. And so I think those money issues will have to be addressed. There's no question. But we thought that the art of possible was to get something more streamlined done, because that seems to be doable at this stage. So
Thanks, Tom. And Jim, with respect to any kind of misalignment between Power Five and Group of Five, I would assume that there are some things that are front and center with respect to the divide, because it seems like, to your point, Arian, about the mean, and there was a lot of polarization. Jim, can you speak to maybe what some of those major issues are between Group of Five and Power Five?
It's interesting, and it's to your point earlier about no matter who you bring to the table, someone's going to feel underrepresented, right? And their issues are not going to get heard. And I think the concern is that because there is such a huge divide, when I say divide, a huge delta between the haves and the have-nots at the FBS level. It's not just the group of five in the Power Five, right? The delta between those at the bottom of the Power Five leagues is as much as 100% increase to the top of the league, right? So how do you remain competitive even if you're there, right? So we see it all the way along the spectrum, but I think this thought, and Ariane showed in one of the slides that's out there, is this equal vote, right? Is one voted, is one weighted and the other not? If we were to split up 100 million in here, would you like to give five of us the authority to split it up, or would everybody like to have a vote on how we do it? Well, most of us would probably say, I want to have a vote at the table, right? Because I want to get my equal share if we're all in this together. And while we're all in this together, those who generate revenue, right, perceive that, and rightly so, and believe that maybe their vote should weigh a little bit more on how the pie is cut, right? So there's this old adage of, hey, I'll let you split the pie any way you want to split it. You cut it up, but then I get first choice. Then all of a sudden the pie becomes a lot more equal. Exactly. Yeah.
Questions from other folks?
I just want to follow up for a minute, Tom. It's Walt Harrison down here at the other end. I can see you for some reason. Maybe you're a little taller than I am and you might not be able to see me. I want to follow up on the money a little bit. They always ask the English professor to ask the money questions. You mentioned Kathleen McNeely coming to the LEAD1 group and talking about $65 million in services that go to cover FBS football, but that are actually paid from the sources that come from the March Madness tournament. I think it's probably more than that. I don't know all the questions about how their legal settlements are funded, but some of them are probably funded by insurance, but others may be coming from the NCAA. So my sense of this is it's more than 65 million all in. All these expenses come from essentially basketball revenue. They're used to cover football for 131 members. The NCAA has about 1,100, a little bit more than 1,100 members. So you've got 1,000 members essentially subsidizing the costs of football for 131 members. My question then is what does LEAD, apparently what you're just saying is we're just going to leave that question on the table, but you can imagine that it rankles a lot of people who don't play football or don't play FBS football. And it really begs the question of, if the money flows in that direction, why doesn't the governance also? In other words, why not push for the football revenues generated by the CFP to cover the football expenses? Isn't that as important as who governs football?
Harris, it's a very good question. It is a core question. In our model, we realize the real politics of this are you have to really tie it closely to the conferences. We have a very fragmented governance system. So we wanted to make sure that the conferences would be, the controlling party of this governing board. Now, we didn't address weighted voting because I can tell you there's a major difference between certain conferences on weighted voting and others, but we felt that we're not the decision maker anyway. We're just advisory. We're giving a plan to come forward. The money issue, theoretically and ideally, you're absolutely correct. There is a continuing misalignment. We felt it needs to be addressed by either the conferences, the CFP, or the NFL. We made that point, and I think even our ADs would agree with that. But again, it gets down to the art of the possible. I mean, first of all, if you streamline this model, put a strong COO in there, and have the conferences deeply aligned with this entity, I think that's step one towards dealing with the alignment issue. If you try to do it all at once, I think it's really, really challenging. And there is a real desire to keep the NCAA on the front lines of this because of the number one reason why why folks want FBS football, the governance in the NCAA is the legal shield. The legal shield. So Jim, do you have any comment on that? We thought that needs to be addressed. That's step 2. Step 1 should figure out a way to make this more streamlined, less bureaucratic. Think about some decisions, and Peter, you know this, some decisions can go to the football oversight. It can go to the D1 council. It can go to the board of directors and sometimes to the board of governors. And they thought there was just a better way to run a railroad than that method.
Yeah, I would just describe it in Walt, if I can use your first name.
Yeah,
I-
everyone does.
I would describe it as it's a really big elephant. And we all know the saying, you know, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. So we think that creating the right structure will help us get to the other bites that need to be taken because they certainly need to be addressed. There's absolutely no question. I think your point's well taken.
I hope that, Dr. Hanson, I hope that gives you a little bit of the context about the discussion that we went through.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it would be the position of the night commission that you could take it all on at once, or you could take it on and, as you say, in steps. I think that's a tactical question, but it sounds like hypothetically you agree with the idea that the costs that come from football should be covered by the revenues that come from football.
I would say that the cost that the NCAA is occurring on football, that there needs to be every exploration of whether those costs should be covered by the conferences, other CFP or the NFL. I mean, that's what we said in our paper.
Thank you.
Yeah, as you guys talk about the governing body, so it's a good transition to the governing body. You know, the night commission is really pleased that you have added the independent directors. You know, you talked about a 15 person board, the health and safety experts, former you know, FBS athletes, that kind of stuff. So we're really happy that you've done that. But as you look about at the top of the board, right? So you guys took care of up to the FPS. Would you recommend adding those same principles to the governing board, you know, to the top of the NCAA Division I board? We've recommended that. I think it's a really good recommendation to go down that path and add those people to that board. Where's LEAD1 on that, and what would you propose in that instance?
So I could give you my personal view, but that's not what you're asking. What we try to do when we put these things out there is to really try to listen to our ADs and express their view. We did not focus on that issue. So I don't know where the consensus of our ADs were. I don't think there was any big problem putting independent directors on the football governing board. If that's meaningful, symbolic, that was certainly the case, right, Jim? That's correct. Yeah.
So Tom, I understand you're not at a point where you want to address the financial situation and all of the questions surrounding that, but you just said that, you know, the costs for governance on football should come from the NCAA or the members or the CFP or professional football, the NFL. Would it make sense, or could your group entertain the idea of making a statement that came at it a very different way, but could be very helpful? And that is that the NCAA existing revenue structure should not have to absorb the costs associated with governance of football. I mean, that would go along. That's one, it's a bite, and it's a small bite, but it's a bite that would make a big difference, I think.
It's interesting. Some of our ADs responded to that, that saying, you know, that's what our members are want. They want basketball to pay for this football governance. That's what we've heard from a number of ADs. So I don't know if, again, let me be clear here. I mean, we're not we're only an advisory organization. We try to represent the voice of our very disparate ADs. And the idea that how that issue's tackled is one that we did not, get into in detail with our ADs, certainly something we could in the future. But I do feel that in our work groups, as I said, there were comments about the NFL, there were comments but no one ever said that, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong in the discussion, no one ever said that it's wrong the NCAA has to pay for these costs. Right. Conversely, some ADs said that's what the membership wants. I heard some ADs come back to me that way. So it's mixed. And by the way, I mean, it's something we can talk about in the future, but we did not have a clear picture on it out of our meeting.
So can you take 1 second, explain what their rationale, how do they justify having basketball cover that? How the folks, the AD saying it's right that basketball covers the football expense. What's their logic behind it?
I think Jim said it best. The NCAA is the members, right? So, I mean,
I was just thinking, it doesn't matter where you park the money, right? At the end of the day, if I don't get part of that revenue distribution, I'm still paying for it. So you could take 65 million from CFP and put it over the NCAA. It just means whatever's dispersed out of the CFP is going down by 65 million divided by the number of schools that are participating in it, right? And so at the end of the day, I don't think most of us are wired to think about who's paying for what expense. It is, how do we maximize revenue? How do we lower expenses? It's coming out of one bucket or the other, right? So to me, it's going to get paid from someplace. As an example, I can't remember, it might have been the first part of this summer, there was a lawsuit that was finally settled by the NCAA. And I'm looking at Kevin and Jen back there. They probably know exactly what I'm referencing. And it was a huge amount of money. And then it initially came out that we're going to push that down to all the individual members, i.e. the UTEPs. Every single school is going to pay for that lawsuit. All of us went, oh, wait, you can't do that. We didn't plan for that. You guys pay it. So, okay, so they paid it, but that money wasn't there to be distributed to us. So someone's going to pay the bill. Right. So whether it's coming out of the CFP, whether it's coming out of the NCAA, I don't think most of us are thinking, well, that expense should be allocated to that entity. It's really somebody's going to pay it. Wherever it's going to have to get paid from is going to get paid. And then what's the resulting revenue distribution to my institution or the conference from my perspective?
So Jim, there's a big difference, I think, in what you just said. And that difference is that the NCAA as a membership organization has this agreement that the membership should cover the costs of different types of things. But in this particular case, the CFP gets all the money and the NCAA has all the responsibility and the costs. And the costs that are incurred to look at student athlete eligibility for football is carried by the NCAA. The CFP is taking the revenue from the playoff, all of that revenue, but that cost means that Division II and Division III schools don't get as big a distribution of funds. Yeah. And so in one case, you're talking about things that impact the whole membership. In other case, the CFP has all the revenue, but none of the responsibility or costs associated with that. And Arnie's question about, what's the rationale? I'm not sure how as an AD I can justify that other than I get a lot of CFP money and I really don't want to share it. And I mean,
But let me just say this, that's exactly right. And so I'm not arguing with what you're saying. And I recognize that looks like I'm not being fair to somebody else. Therein lies the problem of what we have, right? We have different organizations that have different buckets of money, and depending on if you're in the pool or you're not in the pool determines your thought process, right? So I agree with you 100%. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The flip side of that is what people will say who generate those revenues is that, well, we're generating the revenue. Why should I share it with anybody else when they don't generate the revenue? So this thing goes round and round and round all the time. But I would concur with what you're saying.
But if people don't start thinking about the collective good, then folks like Congress are going to impose their will because they don't think it's fair. And so if we're looking for solutions that Congress can help with, then we've got to show the will to think about the collective good, and in particular, what's in the best interest of students.
Let me, can I jump in there now?
Chris, please jump in. Thank you.
Yeah, I've enjoyed the conversation. First off, I got to say, and I'm going to pick up the CFP strain. I appreciate Congressman McMillan having a conversation where you keep talking about the art of the possible. You're quoting Otto von Bismarck, the German premier, I believe, and also we're talking about an organization that was started by Teddy Roosevelt. So our Oxford tutorials from years ago as Rhodes Scholars have paid off. So at least in that regard. I'm also wanted just to mention that having spent a lot of hours looking at football with Gene Smith and Kerry Barta, two fine people who were smart enough to say precisely what the Knight Commission said and get a hell of a lot more press. This shows you what the power of college sport is, because we were kind of saying the same thing for a while, and then they said it and it got picked up. But I really commend LEAD1 on their work. So back to the CFP strand, which Peter and everybody kind of eloquently picked up already, so forth and so on. Bottom line, and I spent a lot of time with Bill Hancock, 3 years on the selection committee, not on the management committee. It is a event planning organization that passes through all the football stuff that's got to be more and more wealthy in the next couple of years, going to $2 billion in revenue. But it's not a nonprofit educational entity. Say perhaps the foundation piece, which does the great thing for school teachers, which I think is outstanding. Having said that, Tom, what about oversight of, because you're LEAD1, you're not just NCAA, you're LEAD1. What about oversight of CFP and ensuring that it brings to the forefront the values of college sport, of the college athlete, as Peter mentioned a second ago, and ensuring that it behaves like a nonprofit that is associated with education, not just with putting on great events and lining up the good football dossier there?
Well, I always loved your Oxford references, my friend. So thank you. I don't think we have an AD. I don't know of an AD that has said anything really negative about the CFP and how it's run. I'll defer to Jim again. There is very high regard to that organizational structure, which is run by presidents and a management committee. So we have not had anybody say that there's a problem there. And part of our thinking and strategic approach here was step one, step two. The money needs to be addressed. It should be addressed. Ideally, if the NCAA had locked down basketball, I think they would have a lot more leverage on this issue. The reality of it is that there is a fear, I think, that someone would try to create a new March Madness. And so this is a really tricky issue. And what I felt the first step should be is set up a structure that is, when I say we, or I mean our group felt that we should set up a structure strongly aligned to the conferences. Now you can work out the weighted voting. You may have to have that in place, but this is going to be their entity. And hopefully with that structure, the money issue can be addressed down the stream, down the road. And Chris, I don't know if that addresses your issue. We try to listen to our ADs, but we've never heard a comment that the CFP is not, I mean, Jim, do you agree with that? The CFP is held in high regard.
I believe it is. I don't hear a lot of comments about how it's ran or the revenue distribution piece of that per se, or that what is the overhead, what does it take for them to run or anything of that nature. So I think people talk more about playoff expansion and the opportunities for student athletes to have a shot at a legitimate championship by having a more inclusive championship experience. I can tell you as an FCS athletic director, I used to laugh a little bit, quite frankly, when we had a playoff system, right? In Division II and Division III had a playoff system with student athletes being able to go all the way to the end and have a championship. And only one team was going to end the season with with winning the cup, winning the championship. And for years, FBS said, "Oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. Oh my God, because we care about our student athletes too much to do that." Like I didn't care about my student athletes at the FCS level. It was kind of crazy, right? When you think about it, because we could do it there, but we can't do it for FBS. The truth is there are a lot of different stakeholders, right? Like the bowl games, in the television contracts and the conferences. So there's a lot at play in terms of who's pulling the strings in getting things done. But I don't think there's really a problem there. Just think about this, y'all. But 65 million, will 65 million make everybody happy if I give it to you today? Okay, well, let's do it. You guys just got $65 million. The NCAA is hold of $65 million that FBS uses in its resources. And if you want to divide that by 1,100 NCAA institutions, it's about $59,000 a year. That's what you're going to get. Because, right, we're going to give it back to the NCAA. NCAA is going to distribute it. That's all it amounts to, $59,000. I'm not saying that that's pocket change. I'm just saying the grand scheme of things, with all of us running our enterprises, that's not a lot of money. It's not going to be game changing, even though it is a significant issue that's on the table that everybody looks at and goes, well, this doesn't seem like it's right or it's fair. And I get that part. I really do.
Hey, Jim, last thing I wanted to say to you is that thank you for your candor. Big fan of your president, by the way. Heather Wilson has been a mentor of mine for years, but hey, ADs have a job to do, and you are the athletic director of the University of Texas El Paso, not the athletic director for, all of college sports. So you're you just calling it like you see it, I think is welcome in the room and in the Zoom, and we need this sort of candor to make the best decisions going forward.
Christine, we have about 10 minutes left. Sean, to be honest, we'll go 1, 2. We have about 10 minutes left. Who else? And Eric, sorry. So try to do 1, 2, 3 pretty quickly. Short question, short answer. So let's go 1, 2. Eric, you get the final word.
Yes, I guess this goes to Tom or Jim. We just mentioned the structure of the college football playoff board and their decision-making process. And we mentioned students, so we're all here on behalf of the students today, talking specifically of football players. I'm encouraged that your model that you all came up with in your kind of separate branch of the NCAA structure with the FBS piece has designated spots for students who played the sport and for some independent directors. How do you feel about that also happening in the CFP governance structure? And would you, if not, I mean, you think it's a good idea in one realm, I just suspect it could be a great idea there too. And would you be willing to push for that?
I just want you to understand one thing. Right now in college sports, there is very little interplay between conferences. It's a very stovepipe kind of siloed existence. That's how it works. LEAD1, we try to create an environment legally protected. We had Holland Knight telling us, don't get into student benefits. That includes anything that might be construed as collusion. So we had to be very careful, even on health and safety and any of those issues, not to cross over. So when we get together, we try to talk about subjects that are really, really important to our ADs. We did not address any of the CFP issues because there wasn't any dissatisfaction. So, I mean, we can ask our ADs how they feel about it. I don't think they have a problem with independent directors. That's the sense that I get. Jim?
I would agree, Tom. I don't think anybody has any issues or challenges with that. And I think most of us all recognize we are not going to be able to run these organizations the way they were ran 20 and 30 years ago, right? In an authoritative fashion, and we're going to make all the decisions. We have got to find ways to involve current student athletes, former student athletes, right, as decision makers, and so that they have a voice. We really do. So that therein lies part of the challenge. And as I think about what this may look like 10, 15 years from now, I honestly do think we'll probably see student athletes as employees. Now, that scares me to death. It really does. Anybody who's hired somebody and had to fire somebody understands the issues, right? But when I think about where things are headed, so in the crack in the door is NIL, right? There's the Alston Awards, there's cost of attendance. When cost of attendance showed up here 10 years ago, right? Everybody thought it was going to be the end of college athletics. And we've somehow managed to assimilate that into, what we do, and we continue to move on. But when I think about people having a voice, their voice is going to be heard. When I talk to our coaches today, predominantly our two marquee coaches of revenue generation sports, they tell me that the first question out of every student athlete's mouth that they talk to, it isn't about the quality of the education in my major and my playing time. It is, what kind of NIL opportunities do I have? Right. And they're not talking about, I've got this great brand, I want to monetize it. They're saying, how much money are you going to get to me in some way, shape, or form? That's pay for play. Right. So I think about that. I go, is this what this has become? Because it's not what I signed up for. Right. And that's why I keep going back to and asking the question, how much is enough? How much do we have to do when we provide you room, board, books, fees, tuition, cost of education? Now that we can provide an Alston Award to you as well. And no one's even tested the boundaries of that legally, right? Because it could go more than what the 59,800 or 5,980, I think is the number, if I remember correctly. So no one's even challenged that, but somebody's going to challenge it at some point in time, give $10,000 worth of awards, I think. And then we'll see how long it gets tied up in the courts. So I don't know, but I fear that we have to be very, very careful so everybody understands the limitations of the model, because there's only so much we can do. And we've got to be fiscally responsible on behalf of all student athletes, not just football and men's basketball players. Every single student athlete's voice matters, and they all are putting in the same amount of effort. They derive the same kind of benefits from competition in intercollegiate athletics. But how do we protect the entire model? And I'm a little bit concerned about where this goes if it's an employee-based model.
Go, Shantae, anything you can add?
Tom, I heard you when you said, the financial piece is step 2, and that you want to model or have a CEO or a football czar. That was retracted, but a football czar that oversees football. But Dan oversees championships and revenue. So shouldn't this COO have influence over the spending of the money from championships? Yeah.
Again, we preferred using the term of chief operating officer. I mean, it's just obvious that football is a big part of the regular season. If you look, as I said, at the NCAA's leadership structure, it's missing. If you talk to NCAA folks, they'll say, where's the football person here? We're not trying to solve the world here. We're saying that's needed. Look, football championship is outside. It's not outside of our realm here. We ended up really making a recommendation that we felt if you decided to do it, what the Knight Commission did, create an entity outside of the NCAA. By the way, it would look a lot like what we proposed. It would be, you would want it to be strongly aligned with the conferences. You'd want independent people on it. You want the football coaches represented, but you're still going to have reporting up to the higher ed authorities. It would look exactly like, the only difference is the money. I mean, that's really the one thing. So if you put it outside, you still have the money issue. We thought that if we tried to do it outside, we would have to solve the money issue. And that's a very thorny issue. That's going to take some time. And we do think it needs to be solved, but it does not need to be solved up front. And you're right. Basketball isn't the same as football, but this model is just simpler, less bureaucratic, but it would look very much a mirror image if it were moved outside, except for the money.
I was just gonna suggest that perhaps the fact that nobody's complaining about the CFP is not a particularly good justification for doing something different. After all, they have a rather specific and narrow role They got to pick the top teams. They got to run a good event. And they need media contracts and have growth in funding. People are more satisfied with the playoff, especially as it's expanded. Running a good event is not rocket science. And when you've got that type of material, arguing for good media contracts, not so bad. So all the problems and difficulty are on the other side of the ledger. And you sit there and look at it defined, not even here, let me give you your $65 million while the money I have goes up astronomically. You have issues like, how can you promote greater diversity and equity in college sports? How do you do a better job in mental health? These are incredibly difficult and challenging problems, but we aren't tying them to the growth in the dollars. If you had that type of synergism that is there, then these problems that we know in terms of what the student athletes are involved in have a mechanism by which they can grow. They can grow as well. And so I think actually the statement that do you want $65 million is actually detouring us from the fact that if the dollars are connected to policy and management, you will do new things. You will solve problems in a different way, as opposed to, I would be well, I was the Big Ten rep there for a long time in the CFP. Every meeting we patted ourselves on the back because there weren't complaints about, who was going to the championship. That's not actually solving the problem. So I think tying them gives you an opportunity where there's college athletes benefits from the growth in resources, where having it separated does not at all.
I'm going to jump in just from my unique perspective working with LEAD1 over the last 6 months or so. And not that, but Mike, can you pull up our slide set? Oh, it's back. Okay, so whoops. So the money, what we've been talking about for the majority of the time today, and also what the ADs very much, I think, are in support of this idea. One issue with LEAD1 is they represent the group of 5 and the power 5 ADs, which are very, very, very different. And everyone knows that. So is there a way to get consensus among this group? And what does it look like? How do we divide up this massive amount of money? And how do we give hope to the group of 5 ADs that are there? One of the things we talked about in our focus group discussions was, how do we divide up this big group? If you look at other league comparisons, the NFL has 32, the NBA has 30. We will next year have 133 in the football bowl subdivision. And that makes it very challenging with the polarization of perspectives for LEAD1 or any organization to bring everyone together and say, yes, this Big Ten, SEC, you're going to do this for the rest of us. So building off of that, really the only way is for what the ADs called for in the survey, and that's a collective media strategy from my perspective, not necessarily LEAD1's, but something that where there are tiers, not necessarily based on the conferences for football, which addresses a lot of the issues that have led us where we are relative to conference realignment and the financials. But I will say the ADs largely agree that the money should follow the organizational structure.
Your points are right on. In drafting bills in Congress, you'd put a wish list together, and then the reality comes down to what can get passed. And that's often a fraction of what you want. That's the compromise. I actually believe this is would be a very positive step forward, not inconsistent with the Knight Commission's recommendations, but that we all have to focus on alignment for the future. There's no question about it.
you know, just to, sorry, there's no better time to do new things when $1.5 billion drops on the table that you didn't have before. There's no better time than that. And so I take as the example, coming out of the Knight Commission, talking about advancing diversity in coaching and the opportunity for schools, classes, accreditation, whatever it is that promotes this as a process. I said, well, why can't we do this out of the foundation of the CFP? Why can't we? And really, it's not even something that there's an interest and focus in at doing it all. And that's why I think this separation to me, especially with $1.5 billion dropping on the table, why this separation is flawed. Because then who pays for that? And if it appears to come out of everybody's pocket, it's not going to happen. But if you have 1.5 billion in new money, yeah, you can sneak a few things in there that could have a profound impact. So sorry. So just real quickly, Eric, the way the NCAA addressed the issue of recognizing institutions for academic performance was when the television, so the funds for academic performance come from the future revenues from the television contract. And I mean, that's exactly what they did on academic performance and what institutions get. Nobody was willing to give up anything that they already had, but they were willing to give up something that they didn't have yet. And that worked.
Just want to thank Ariane and Jim and Tom for your time and thoughtfulness. And you see there's a lot of energy. People are not rushing to get to lunch. We probably want to keep talking this through, but thanks so much for coming and for being so honest. For the media in the room and on Zoom, we'll have a press conference in about 10 minutes. So please stay tuned, but please give our guests a round of applause. Thank you so much.